Usually when we talk about a medical diagnosis, there's this expectation of absolute precision.
Right, yeah.
It feels like engineering. Like, you break your arm, the x-ray shows that jagged white line on the screen, and the doctor just points at it with a pen and says, well, there it is.
Exactly. It's binary. It's broken, or it's not broken.
Yeah.
We really like things to be visible like that, to be categorized neatly into folders in our mind.
Right. It's comforting, but then you step into the world of human communication. You step into the realm of trying to persuade another human being to change their mind or, buy a product or care about a cause. And suddenly that x-ray machine is just utterly broken.
Completely useless.
Yeah. We're looking at a landscape that is murky and unpredictable and highly, highly subjective. Which brings me to the question I want to pose to you, the listener, right out of the gate today. I want you to think about your own life for a second. Why is it that you can sit through a highly detailed 60-slide corporate presentation, completely zone out, and forget every single data point the moment you walk out the door?
Oh, we've all been there.
Right. But then you vividly, perfectly remember a random detail about a Star Wars toothbrush from a story you heard a decade ago. Or, why do you remember the specific speaker who pulled a real human brain out of a bag on stage, even if you can't remember what year it happened?
It is genuinely one of the most fascinating paradoxes of human behavior.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, we spend hours, sometimes weeks or months, compiling data, building these complex charts.
All those pivot tables.
Exactly. Structuring these airtight logical arguments, operating under this massive assumption that the sheer weight of our logic will inevitably win the day.
Yeah.
But the human brain simply does not process information like a hard drive. Speaking, presenting, communicating it isn't just about transferring raw data from one brain to another. It is fundamentally about cognitive stickiness.
Cognitive stickiness. I love that phrasing. And that's exactly what we're digging into today on this deep dive.
Yeah.
We've got a huge stack of research on the psychology of persuasion, anchored heavily by Akash Karia's comprehensive guide. He took the famous Successes framework, which stands for simple, unexpected, concrete, credible, emotional story, and he adapted it specifically for public speaking and presentations.
Right.
So our mission today, right here, is to deconstruct the architecture of the world's most captivating presentations. We're going to walk step by step through how to craft a message that is biologically impossible to ignore and psychologically impossible to forget.
We are really going to look under the hood today.
Yeah.
We aren't just looking at what successful speakers do, on a surface level. We're dissecting the underlying cognitive mechanisms, the why and the how behind messages that actually manage to endure in the human brain.
So if cognitive stickiness is the absolute goal, where do we actually begin? Because my instinct, and I think a lot of people's instinct, is to immediately worry about my slides or maybe my body language.
Yeah.
But looking at the success framework, the starting line, that first S, isn't about performance at all. It's about simplicity, finding a core message.
Yeah, the foundation of any memorable message has to be simplicity. But we need to be very, very careful with how we define that word.
Okay, how so?
Because finding your simple core message isn't about dumbing down your content for the audience. A lot of people get defensive about that.
Right, they feel like they're insulting their audience's intelligence.
Exactly. But it's not that. It is about forced prioritization. Look, if you are speaking for 18 minutes on big stage, or even just giving a 30-minute budget pitch to a board, your audience is going to forget a massive percentage of what you say almost immediately.
It's kind of tragic.
It is. The cognitive drop-off is staggering. Studies routinely show that audiences lose 20% before they even reach the parking lot.
Wow.
50% by the next day, and 80% within a few days.
Which is deeply depressing if you're the one who spent 3 weeks making that slide deck.
It really is.
Yeah.
But knowing that biological limitation is actually your greatest advantage, you have to ask yourself a ruthless question. If the listener remembers only one single sentence from everything I've just spent the last half hour saying, what must that sentence be?
It's the ultimate editing process. I was reading through the historical examples and the source material, and the one that really stood out as a masterclass in this kind of ruthless prioritization comes from political history, specifically the 1992 U.S. presidential campaign.
Well, that is a perfect case study in cutting through complexity. Think about the landscape of a national political campaign, especially back in 1992. Bill Clinton's team was staring down a vast, tangled web of issues.
Right.
You have foreign policy, healthcare reform, national security, immigration, drug policy, education. I mean, it is an absolute war zone of talking points and white papers.
Yeah, and if you try to communicate all of that simultaneously to the public, you're just generating white noise.
Yeah.
Nobody can process that.
Exactly. The campaign leadership realized that to actually capture the attention of the voting public, they could not fight on 50 intellectual fronts at once. They had to ruthlessly prioritize.
Okay.
So they boiled the entire philosophical and logistical weight of a presidential campaign down to one sentence, which they famously hung in their campaign headquarters.
It's the economy, stupid.
It's the economy, stupid.
It is incredibly blunt, almost aggressively simple.
It is. But look at what it accomplishes mechanically. That phrase wasn't their entire platform. They still had healthcare policies, they still had foreign policy plans, but it was the core message that dictated everything else.
Uses the filter.
Exactly. It forced prioritization for every single person on the team. If a speechwriter wanted to add a paragraph about a new initiative, the filter was, does this relate back to kickstarting the economy? If no, it gets cut. It acts as an absolute anchor.
Well, let me push back on this a little bit, though.
Sure, go ahead.
Because I understand it in the context of a broad political campaign. But what if my topic is just inherently deeply complex? Let's say I'm an engineer, right? And I'm giving a presentation on the intricacies of global supply chain logistics or algorithmic trading or quantum physics. If I boil all of that incredible necessary complexity down to one single blunt sentence, don't I inherently destroy the nuance? Aren't I kind of cheating the audience out of the actual substance of my work?
That is the most common fear highly intelligent professionals have when they are asked to simplify. It feels like a betrayal of the work, like you're cheapening it.
Yeah, exactly.
But think of it through the analogy of architecture. The core message is the foundation of the house. It's not the entire house.
Okay.
You're still going to build the walls, you're going to put on the roof, you're going to wire the electricity. That's where your nuance, your data, your complex supply chain arguments live. But without the concrete foundation, the entire house collapses into the mud.
Okay, I see. So the simple message doesn't replace the data, it supports it. It gives the data something to stand on.
Precisely. If a piece of data, no matter how objectively fascinating you find it, doesn't directly support that core foundation, you have to throw it away. You are saving your audience from cognitive overload.
That makes a lot of sense. Now, the text mentions that once you have this foundation, this core idea, you need to forge it into a power phrase, something under 10 words.
Yes.
I immediately thought of this like the chorus of a pop song. You might listen to a song on the radio and have absolutely no idea what the lyrics in the second verse are, but when the chorus hits, you know every single word. And you walk away humming that hook.
A power phrase functions exactly like a musical hook. It is designed to be highly repeatable. And the text outlines specific rhetorical devices, essentially psychological tricks, that make these phrases lodge themselves in our neural pathways.
Let's break those down, because I love the mechanics of this. The first one it mentions is contrast.
Contrast is incredibly effective because the human brain is a difference engine. We notice when things change, we notice opposites. Dan Pink uses this brilliantly in his famous talk about the science of motivation. He's arguing against traditional reward systems, and he distills his core message by saying the solution isn't a sweeter carrot or a sharper stick.
Sweeter carrot, sharper stick. It's pitting two vivid opposites against each other.
And because it creates a clear boundary, a vivid distinction, the brain categorizes it so easily. Another powerful structural device is chiasmus.
Chiasmus.
Yeah, it's a Greek term, and it's where you reverse the order of words in two parallel phrases.
Oh, like John F. Kennedy. Ask not what your country can do for you. Ask what you can do for your country.
The ultimate example. The structural symmetry of that phrase creates a cognitive loop. It feels finished. It feels complete to the ear, which makes it deeply satisfying to remember.
It does have a really satisfying ring to it.
It really does.
Yeah.
But perhaps the most interesting device, purely from a psychological standpoint, is rhyme and alliteration.
Okay, now this is where I get slightly skeptical. I know Robert Cialdini, who is basically the godfather of persuasion science, talks about this. But the claim is that rhyming statements are actually perceived by the human brain as being more truthful than non-rhyming statements.
Yes.
Does my brain really think something is a fact just because it sounds like a Dr. Seuss book? I mean, come on.
It sounds absurd, I know. But the empirical data backs it up. It's a cognitive bias known as the rhyme as reason effect.
Rhyme as reason.
Yeah. And to understand why it works, you have to look at how the brain expends energy. The brain is inherently lazy. It wants to conserve calories. When it encounters information that is difficult to process, it feels a tiny bit of cognitive friction. But rhymes are predictable. They are incredibly easy for the brain to process fluently.
Ah, so it's a path of least resistance.
Exactly. And here is the glitch in our software. Our brains mistake that processing fluency for accuracy. Yes. We subconsciously think, well, that was very easy to understand. Therefore, it must be correct.
Yeah.
So when a speaker says something like, trust is a must,
Yeah.
or when a lawyer famously says, if it doesn't fit, you must acquit the jury's brain is physically comforted by the phonetic resolution.
That is wild.
And alliteration works on the same principle, repeating consonant sounds. Think of Martin Luther King Jr.'s dream that his children will be judged not by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character.
Color, skin, content, character, the repeated C sounds give it a rhythm.
It makes the phrase musical. It bypasses the critical, analytical part of the brain and speaks directly to the pattern-recognizing rhythmic part of the brain.
Okay, so we've done the hard work, we've ruthlessly prioritized, we have our simple core foundation, and we've crafted our pop song hook, our power phrase. How do we actually build the house around it?
Right.
The source material lays out an architectural blueprint called the ABCC structure. Attention-grabbing opening, body conclusion, clear call to action, and it places massive, massive emphasis on that first A, the attention-grabbing opening.
It places emphasis there because that is where most speakers unwittingly lose the entire battle. The importance of the opening comes down to a deeply ingrained cognitive bias known as the primacy effect.
Now, I know the recency effect is about remembering the end of something, so the primacy effect must be about the beginning. But how rigid is this biological rule?
Extremely rigid. It has to do with how our short-term memory buffers work. When we listen to a presentation, our brains are essentially taking notes, but the buffer fills up quickly.
Like RAM on a computer.
Exactly like RAM. The information we hear in the very beginning gets stored with high fidelity because the buffer is empty. By the time we get to the middle of a 20-minute talk, the buffer is overflowing and the brain starts discarding information just to keep up.
Wow.
The first 30 seconds set the emotional, intellectual, and physiological tone. If you don't secure the listener's full attention in that tiny window, they will mentally check out. They will look at their phone, they will think about their grocery list, and bringing them back once they've drifted is extraordinarily difficult.
And yet, knowing that, if we think about the standard corporate presentation, people violate this biological rule constantly. I was looking at what the text calls the deadly sins of presentation openings, and I realized I have committed almost all of them.
Oh, we all have.
The first one is the me-focused history lesson.
Ah, the corporate bio.
Right. Hi, my name is John. I'm the VP of whatever at XYZ Corp. We were founded in 1998. We have offices in 6 countries. Our mission is holistic synergy. I've literally watched audiences glaze over in real time.
They glaze over because it violates the most fundamental rule of human attention. The audience, generally speaking, only cares about themselves.
It sounds harsh, but it's true.
It is true. When you stand up and talk about your company's founding year, their subconscious is screaming, what does this have to do with me?
The second deadly sin is one I think is driven purely by nervousness, which is insincere gratitude. Starting with, thank you so much for having me. It's such an honor to be here. The weather in Chicago has been lovely.
Yes.
Look, I get it. It's polite. But the text argues, it instantly makes you sound identical to the last 500 speakers they've heard. You become auditory wallpaper.
You are wasting the pristine, empty, short-term memory buffer on pleasantries. Such a missed opportunity. And the third deadly sin is perhaps the most dangerous, opening with a canned joke from a joke book.
Oh, the forced corporate humor. It's agonizing. Why does it always fail so spectacularly?
It fails for a few reasons. First, unless you are a trained stand-up comedian, your timing is likely going to be off. Stand-ups spend years perfecting the micro-pauses required to land a punchline.
Right.
Second, the joke usually has absolutely nothing to do with the actual message of the speech. It creates cognitive dissonance. The audience laughs or, doesn't. And then you awkwardly pivot to third quarter earnings. The tension is palpable.
I always try to think of a great speech opening like the cold open of a brilliant movie. You don't start a James Bond movie with a narrator reading Bond's resume.
No, you don't.
You start with a car chase on a glacier. Or think of Martin Scorsese's Goodfellas. The screen goes black, you hear a car driving, and suddenly a guy opens a trunk and Ray Liotta says, "As far back as I can remember, I always wanted to be a gangster." Boom.
Perfect example.
You are completely hooked. You are thrust instantly into the world with zero preamble.
That is a phenomenal analogy, and the best public speakers operate exactly like film directors in those first 30 seconds. The text identifies 5 specific, proven openers that function just like a cold open.
Okay, let's hear them.
The first is starting with a story. When you start with, in 2014, I was standing on the edge of a bridge, you immediately bypass the logical, skeptical part of the audience's brain. You engage their imagination.
They want to know what happens next. The second proven opener is asking a question. I imagine this works because it creates a knowledge gap. If I point at you and ask a direct question, your brain is almost physically compelled to try and formulate an answer.
Yes, exactly.
It turns a passive monologue into an interactive dialogue, even if they don't answer out loud.
It forces mental participation. You can't ignore a direct question. The third opener is a short quote. But the key here is that the quote must be from a highly credible, recognized source. You are essentially borrowing their authority and transferring it to yourself.
Makes sense.
The fourth is a startling statement, something that breaks their understanding of the world. And the fifth is a callback.
Which is referencing something that just happened earlier in the conference or event. Like, I know the previous speaker just told you AI is going to solve all our problems. I'm here to tell you why he's dead wrong.
Right. It proves you are present in the room with them. It proves this isn't a canned, rehearsed piece you've given 100 times. It builds immediate rapport.
Okay, so you execute the cold open. You hook them with a startling statement or a story. But the text argues that you can't just rest on that hook. Very early on in those first few minutes, you have to explicitly answer that subconscious question you mentioned earlier, what's in it for me?
Yes, WIIFM.
You have to lock them in using what the source calls the big promise and the pain statement.
Think of the big promise as an explicit contract you make with the listener. In the next 20 minutes, I am going to show you a framework that will cut your weekly meeting times in half. It is a specific, tangible, highly desirable benefit.
But the text says the promise isn't enough on its own. You have to pair it with the pain statement.
Because human psychology is deeply asymmetrical. We are certainly motivated by the desire to gain pleasure or save time, but evolutionary biology has hardwired us to be far more powerfully motivated by the desire to avoid pain.
Loss aversion.
Exactly. On the savannah, missing out on a delicious berry was a bummer, but missing the signs of a predator was fatal. So our brains prioritize threats. The pain of losing $50 registers as roughly twice as intense as the joy of finding $50.
That's incredible.
So an effective pain statement highlights the cost of inaction. Every single week you don't use this framework, you are burning thousands of dollars in lost productivity and watching your best employees burn out.
Now, I have to stop and ask about the ethics of this. Because when I read that, it felt a little dark. Intentionally making the audience uncomfortable, poking at their pain points just to keep them paying attention. It feels manipulative.
It's a very fair concern. The line between persuasion and manipulation is intent. If you are poking at a pain point to sell them a useless product, that is manipulation. Absolutely.
Right.
But if your framework genuinely works, if it truly will save them time and burnout, then highlighting the pain of their current situation is actually an act of service. You are simply waking them up to a reality they might have normalized. You are providing the necessary friction to overcome their inertia.
Okay, I can see that. You provide the friction, you wake them up. And then right before you launch into the deep dive of the speech, you give them a roadmap.
The roadmap is a vital piece of cognitive scaffolding. You give the audience mental folders. The most famous example of this is Steve Jobs' 2005 Stanford commencement address. He steps up to the podium, looks at the graduates, and says, "Today, I want to tell you 3 stories from my life." That's it. No big deal. Just 3 stories.
And what does that do to the listener's brain?
Instantly, the audience's brain creates 3 empty folders. They know the structure. As he finishes the first story, they mentally file it away in the folder 1. They feel a sense of completion, and they know exactly where they are in the journey. It dramatically reduces cognitive friction.
That makes total sense.
If you don't give a roadmap, the audience spends half their mental energy trying to guess where you're going rather than listening to what you are saying.
Well, which transitions us perfectly into the body of the speech. We have the hook, we have the promise, we've handed out the mental folders, but the middle of a presentation is notoriously where attention goes to die. They sag. People get bogged down in charts and abstract theories. How do we sustain the tension?
You sustain it through the strategic use of anchors. The concept here is cognitive tethering. Every single point you make, every abstract idea or complex piece of data you introduce must be tied down to something tangible in the listener's memory. If an abstract idea floats untethered, it blows away the moment they leave the room.
The source material lists 10 specific anchors. Let's dig into the most powerful ones. The first, and maybe the most universally potent, is the anecdote, or the story. And the text points to a really fascinating historical example of this Barack Obama's 2004 keynote address at the Democratic National Convention. Now, looking at this strictly as an analytical case study in rhetorical structure, how did he use a story to anchor an abstract concept?
It is a phenomenal example of tethering. At that time in 2004, he was a state senator, largely unknown on the national stage. His core message, his foundation, was a massive, highly abstract concept, the idea of the American dream, the promise of meritocracy and national unity. Now, if he had just stood at the podium and listed statistics about upward mobility and economic policy, it would have floated away. It would have been dry political rhetoric.
Right. No one remembers a bar chart about tax bracket.
Exactly. Instead, within the very first minute of his speech, he anchored that massive abstraction to a highly specific visual narrative. He launched into an anecdote about his grandfather herding goats in Kenya, his father getting a scholarship, his other grandfather joining Patton's army after Pearl Harbor.
He grounded it.
He anchored the idea of national opportunity to the deeply personal, cinematic story of his own family's unlikely trajectory.
So the audience didn't have to struggle to hold on to the policy. They just had to hold on to the image of the goats, the tin roof shack, Patton's army. The story became the anchor for the idea.
Exactly. Another highly effective anchor, especially in technical fields, is acronyms. The military is the ultimate case study for this because they operate in environments where memory failure literally equals death.
Yeah, cognitive load under fire has to be immense. I imagine the brain just dumps all non-essential information when the adrenaline spikes.
It absolutely does. The prefrontal cortex, which handles complex working memory, is heavily compromised by extreme stress. So the military uses acronyms to compress complex checklists into a single, easily retrievable mental file.
Like what?
Take the acronym SALUTE. A scout is under fire, terrified, and spots an enemy encampment. They need to radio back a highly detailed report. They don't try to remember a random list. They use SALUTE situation, activity, location, unit, time, equipment.
It guides their memory sequentially.
Yes. Or BRASS for marksmanship. Breathe, relax, aim, slack, squeeze. It turns an abstract procedure into a tangible anchor.
And then there are analogies. I'm a massive fan of analogies. The text brings up Andy Puddicombe, the former Buddhist monk who founded the Headspace meditation app. He was trying to explain the incredibly abstract, subjective concept of a busy, overwhelmed mind. He doesn't start using neurological terms about overactive amygdalas. He says, the mind whizzes away like a washing machine going round and round. Boom. The moment I hear that, I know exactly what a washing machine looks like, sounds like, and feels like when it's off balance.
Let's look at the neurological mechanics of an analogy. Why does that washing machine image work so well? Learning, at a biological level, is the physical process of creating new neural pathways in the brain. When a speaker introduces a completely unknown, highly abstract concept, the brain struggles because it has to build a completely new pathway from scratch. That takes energy.
So an analogy bypasses that effort.
Analogy builds a bridge. It takes a highly familiar concept, a washing machine, which already has a robust, thick, well-established neural network in your brain, and links the new, unfamiliar concept to it. It piggybacks on your existing understanding. It is quite literally a biological shortcut to comprehension.
Biological shortcut. I love that. Another shortcut to comprehension and belief is the use of demos and testimonials, showing rather than just telling.
Visual evidence overrides auditory skepticism every time.
Steve Jobs was arguably the greatest at this. The text talks about when he wanted to prove Apple's new Safari browser was faster than Internet Explorer. He didn't just put up a PowerPoint slide with a bar chart showing load times in milliseconds.
That would be boring.
Yeah. He put two huge screens on stage side by side. He launched both browsers simultaneously and forced the audience to watch Safari load instantly while Explorer just sat there spinning and stalling. You can argue with a bar chart. You cannot argue with a live demonstration happening in front of your eyes.
It is undeniable proof. And when it comes to testimonials, the text makes a crucial distinction. Most people use testimonials incorrectly. They put up a quote from a client saying, "They were great to work with, highly recommend."
Which is nice, but totally vague.
Vagueness destroys credibility. A vague testimonial floats away. A specific testimonial that includes hard numbers is an anchor. Implementing their software increased our Q4 revenue by 45%, specifically saving us $214,000. The numbers provide the weight.
Okay, so our structure is rock solid. We have the hook, the roadmap, and we are anchoring our points. But human attention is inherently fragile. Even if you were perfectly clear and highly logical, if the rhythm of your speech becomes too predictable, the audience's brain will eventually just go on autopilot. Which leads us to the U in the success framework, engineering the unexpected.
The human brain is, at its core, a prediction machine. It is constantly trying to guess what happens next in its environment to save processing energy. If it successfully predicts the pattern of your speech, your tone, your cadence, the types of slides you use, it concludes there is no new thread or vital information. And it powers down. It habituates.
It gets bored.
Exactly. To wake it up, you have to intentionally break the pattern. You have to introduce novelty.
The source gives an amazing example of breaking a pattern using shocking statistics. Jamie Oliver, the celebrity chef, gave a famous TED Talk about the obesity epidemic. Now, he could have stood on stage and said, 117,000 Americans die every year from diet-related illnesses. That is a massive, objectively terrifying number, but it almost feels too massive to grasp.
This is a profound psychological hurdle. It's the battle between credibility and memorability. Large numbers induce a phenomenon called psychic numbing.
Psychic numbing, let's dive into that. Why does that happen?
It goes back to evolutionary limits. Anthropologists talk about Dunbar's number, the idea that early humans lived in tribes of about 150 people. Our brains developed the capacity to feel deep empathy for individuals and maybe a small group.
Right.
But we simply lack the neural hardware to process the suffering or the reality of 117,000 people. It exceeds our biological capacity for empathy. The tragedy becomes an abstraction. As the number of victims increases, our capacity to care actually decreases.
That is so counterintuitive, but so true. So what did Jamie Oliver do to bypass psychic numbing?
He changed the scale. Instead of the massive annual statistic, he looked at the audience and said, in the next 18 minutes while we chat, 4 Americans will die from the food they eat.
Wow. He shrunk it down.
He localized it. He made the statistic time-bound to the exact duration of the presentation. He brought the abstract, invisible reality into the physical room with them. The audience suddenly feels an intense, immediate urgency. We cannot picture 117,000 people, but we can absolutely picture 4 people. It shatters the psychic numbing and induces profound empathy.
It contextualizes the data. The text has another great example of contextualization regarding wealth. If you read that a tech billionaire is worth $40 billion, again, psychic numbing, we don't know what $1 billion looks like. Our brains just process it as, well, a lot.
Yeah.
But a Wall Street Journal writer contextualized it beautifully. They asked the reader to imagine an average person buying a movie ticket. If the billionaire paid the exact same percentage of his total net worth for a single movie ticket that an average person does, that movie ticket would cost him $19 million.
It forces a visceral gasp. You suddenly understand the scale of the wealth because it's tied to an action you perform regularly. Or take the example of the Intel CEO trying to explain the exponential, almost incomprehensible speed of microprocessor innovation over the decades.
What did he do?
He didn't just read out the processing speeds in megahertz. He compared it to the automobile industry. He said if car innovation had matched microprocessor innovation, a car today would go 470,000 miles per hour and cost 3 cents. It completely shatters your expectation of what the data means.
And sometimes the unexpected isn't a statistic at all. It's a physical action. It's what the text calls a wow moment. We talked about Steve Jobs with the browser test, but his most famous wow moment was the introduction of the MacBook Air.
Oh, legendary.
He's on stage talking about how incredibly thin the laptop is. And instead of just giving the dimensions in millimeters, he walks over to a podium, picks up a standard brown manila interoffice envelope, unwinds the little red string, and slowly pulls a full functioning laptop out of it. The visual was so unexpected, so completely paradigm shifting, that the audience literally gasped.
Yeah.
Or Dr. Jill Bolt Taylor, a neuroanatomist who suffered a stroke, who was trying to explain the biology of the brain. She didn't just use a diagram, she brought a real, preserved human brain onto the stage with the spinal cord still attached.
Those are highly theatrical, incredibly effective moments of breaking the visual pattern.
But here is where my anxiety spikes for the listener. What if your topic is just fundamentally, inescapably dry? Say you are an accountant giving a Q3 budget update to the board, or you are an HR manager explaining incredibly dense compliance changes.
Right.
You can't bring a human brain into a quarterly budget meeting, and you don't have a revolutionary laptop in an envelope. How on earth do you engineer the unexpected in a mundane corporate setting?
That is the daily reality for the vast majority of professionals. If you lack a theatrical prop or a revolutionary product, you must find the unexpected in your intellectual approach. You have to dig into the research to find the hidden, counterintuitive narrative.
Give me an example.
The author Malcolm Gladwell is the undisputed master of this. He routinely takes highly dry, dense academic research like the psychophysics of food taste and uncovers a mind-blowing story, like how a researcher named Howard Moskowitz completely reinvented the spaghetti sauce industry, not by looking for the perfect sauce, but by proving mathematically that there is no single perfect sauce, only perfect sauces.
Right, he proved people secretly wanted chunky sauce even though they never asked for it.
Exactly. The data was dry, but the insight was profoundly unexpected. Or, if you're presenting data that supports the status quo, you engineer the unexpected by actively arguing against conventional wisdom.
How does that work?
For example, if the prevailing thought in your marketing department is that giving consumers more choices makes them happier and drives sales, you design a presentation arguing that more choice actually creates cognitive paralysis and misery.
Oh, I see.
You back it up with data, like psychologist Barry Schwartz did in his paradox of choice research. You position your core message as a counterintuitive truth. That intellectually shocks the audience awake, even if you're just standing in a boardroom in a gray suit.
Okay, so an unexpected moment wakes the brain up. It shatters the pattern. But just because I have your attention doesn't mean I actually have your trust. If I shock you with a startling claim but I can't back it up, I'm not a persuasive speaker. I'm just a carnival barker. How does the success framework suggest we transition from getting a mention to actually earning belief?
That brings us to the first C in success concrete details. Humans are inherently sensory creatures. We process truth and reality through what we can see, hear, smell, and feel. Vague, abstract language is the absolute enemy of credibility.
To illustrate why sensory details matter, the source brings up a story that has survived for over 2.5 millennia. Aesop's fable, The Boy Who Cried Wolf. We all knew the story, but why has it survived when thousands of other ancient texts vanished?
Question.
It survived because it isn't a dry, abstract, philosophical essay on the ethical dangers of bearing false witness. It's a vivid story. It has concrete characters. It has the auditory detail of the boy shouting. It has the visual of the sheep grazing, the emotional delight of the boy tricking the villagers, and the terror of the actual wolf. We don't just understand the message, we experience it.
Yes.
And to make our audiences experience our messages, the text says we need to utilize the VAKS formula.
VAKS. Visual, auditory, kinesthetic, smell.
The example provided for this is almost uncomfortably visceral. Mike Rowe, the host of the television show Dirty Jobs, gave a presentation where he described his experience castrating sheep.
Oh, this one.
Yeah. Now, he didn't just summarize the event by saying it was a gross, bloody day on the farm. He detailed the exact, precise placement of the knife. He described the physical feeling of the struggle, but the detail that permanently burns into your brain is auditory. He described the specific sound of the act as being like Velcro being yanked off a sticky wall.
It is horrifyingly vivid.
I physically cringed when I read it, but that's exactly the point, isn't it? It forces the audience to build a mental movie. You cannot passively consume that sentence. Your brain is forced to render the audio file of Velcro ripping.
And this brings us to what I believe is one of the most fascinating and consequential psychological studies mentioned in the entire text. It perfectly isolates why that Velcro detail, or any vivid sensory detail, matters so immensely for persuasion. It's the University of Michigan jury experiment involving a fictional woman named Mrs. Johnson.
I was reading through the study in the notes, and I initially thought I misunderstood the premise because the setup sounds completely absurd. Walk me through exactly how they tested this.
The researchers set up a mock jury scenario. The participants were asked to read transcripts from a custody hearing and judge whether Mrs. Johnson was a fit mother. They divided the participants into two distinct groups. Group A read arguments and evidence in favor of Mrs. Johnson. Group B read arguments and evidence against her.
Which is standard psychological testing protocol so far.
But here is where the manipulation happened. The researchers intentionally seeded the transcripts with completely irrelevant but highly concrete sensory details. In Group A, the pro-Johnson transcript included a mundane detail that she ensured her son brushed his teeth every night. But they added a specific sensory detail. He uses a Star Wars toothbrush shaped like Darth Vader.
Okay.
In Group B, the anti-Johnson transcript included a detail that her son scraped his knee on the playground and a nurse had to clean it. But they added, as the nurse was cleaning the scrape, she spilled mercurochrome on herself, stating her uniform red.
Okay, let's pause and look at this logically. Neither a Darth Vader toothbrush nor a clumsy nurse spilling red medicine has absolutely any logical bearing on whether Mrs. Johnson is a good or bad mother. It's completely irrelevant.
Exactly. In a court of law, or purely logical debate, those details are utterly meaningless. Yet, the results were staggering. The group that read the Star Wars toothbrush detail rated her significantly higher as a fit mother. The group with the red stain detail rated her significantly lower.
Why? Why does our highly evolved prefrontal cortex let a novelty toothbrush override logical analysis?
Because of a deeply ingrained cognitive phenomenon called internal credibility. The human brain, constantly trying to save energy, relies heavily on heuristics, which are mental shortcuts, to judge truth. If a story contains highly specific, easily imaginable sensory details like a Darth Vader toothbrush or a vivid red stain, our brain can picture the scene effortlessly. And the brain's shortcut logic dictates, if I can picture this scene this clearly and effortlessly, it must be real. If the scene is real, it is factual. And if these details are factual, the overall argument being presented must also be credible. Vividness acts as a biological proxy for truth.
That is both incredible and honestly slightly terrifying. It means the specific descriptive details we choose to include, even the seemingly minor, tangential ones, are actively hacking the audience's belief system.
Which is exactly why the text advises against using vague temporal language. Instead of saying, a while ago we had a problem, you must say, on the rainy morning of December 10th, 1996, the servers crashed. The specific date and the weather detail create internal credibility. The audience subconsciously trusts the conclusion more because the setup was vivid.
The text also touches briefly on external credibility. This is the structural setup before you even speak your first word on stage. It suggests writing your own introduction for the MC to read, specifically listing your relevant credentials so you don't have to awkwardly brag about yourself on stage.
Always a good idea.
But crucially, it mentions that the most powerful form of external credibility doesn't come from listing your degrees. It comes from sharing your struggles before your successes.
Yes. The legendary motivational speaker Les Brown is highlighted as a prime example here. His introductions do not start with a laundry list of his awards and wealth. They always start by explaining that he was born in an abandoned building, adopted, and later mistakenly labeled educably mentally retarded by the school system. Only after establishing that intense, raw vulnerability does the introduction pivot to list his massive successes as a broadcaster and author.
It builds profound empathy. If you just stand up and list your awards, you appear perfect, which is alienating. The audience thinks, well, of course you succeeded. You're a genius. If you show your scars, you prove you are human. You earn the right to advise them. Which leads us perfectly into the next element of the success framework. You've established credibility, you have concrete details, your message is simple. But as anyone who has ever tried to argue with a family member knows, logic rarely inspires people to actually change their behavior. Emotion drives action.
To connect emotionally with an audience, you must first clear the emotional obstacles in the room. The text refers to this as addressing the elephant in the room. If the audience harbors a burning skepticism, a prejudice, or a glaring question about you as a speaker, they will not hear a single word of your presentation until that tension is addressed.
The source uses a brilliant historical example of this. And just to frame this, we are looking at the speech purely objectively as a masterclass in rhetorical strategy. The example is Malcolm X's famous "the ballot" or "the bullet" speech.
It is a profound study in audience psychology. Malcolm X was speaking in 1964 to a highly diverse audience in Cleveland. He was acutely aware that his religion, the Nation of Islam, was a significant point of contention, suspicion, or division for many people sitting in those chairs. He knew that if he didn't neutralize that tension immediately, his core message about civil rights would be ignored.
So what did he do?
His very first rhetorical move was to turn directly toward the elephant. He explicitly stated his religion. He didn't hide it, but then he immediately drew a boundary. He said, I'm not here tonight to discuss my religion. I'm not here to try and change your religion. In 2 sentences, he acknowledged their underlying anxiety and neutralized it as a distraction.
He cleared the air. And then, having removed the division, he immediately pivoted to fostering what the text calls the we connection.
Yes, uniting a fractured audience by highlighting a common goal, or, in many cases, a common enemy. After setting aside religion, he pointed out that regardless of whether they were Muslim, Christian, or anything else, they were all suffering under the exact same political and economic oppression.
He brought them together.
He masterfully merged their individual divided identities into a collective, powerful we. From a psychological standpoint, uniting an audience against a shared challenge taps into deeply primal, tribal instincts. It is highly emotionally effective.
So you address the elephant, you build the we connection. Another fascinating way to hack the emotional center of the brain is through curiosity. The source talks about the tease before you tell technique. I love this because it's so incredibly simple to implement.
It really is.
Think of the late broadcaster Larry King. When he was going to a commercial break, he wouldn't just say, "We'll be right back after these messages." He'd look directly into the camera and say something like, "Bette Davis, The Beatles, you don't want to miss this." He intentionally opens a loop in your brain.
He is exploiting a curiosity gap. Neurologically, when we are presented with incomplete information that we desire, our brain releases a small amount of dopamine. It creates a literal itch that must be scratched by getting the answer. In a presentation, you shouldn't just list your 3 main points on a slide like a table of contents. You tease the benefits. In just a moment, I'm going to share the single counterintuitive technique that allowed our underperforming team to cut overhead by 20% in 1 quarter. But first, we need to look at you make them crave the information before you finally deliver it.
And we absolutely cannot talk about manipulating the emotional state of an audience without talking about the science of humor. Now, let's clarify a contradiction. The text explicitly warned us earlier in the Deadly Sins section not to tell canned jokes. But here, it strongly encourages the use of humor. What is the actual difference?
It's a crucial distinction. A joke is a rehearsed performance piece. It requires precise timing, a setup, and a punchline. Humor, in the context of persuasive speaking, is simply the act of creating an expectation in the listener's mind and then suddenly, playfully breaking it. That sudden, harmless pivot is what causes the neurological release of tension that we express as laughter.
The Sir Ken Robinson example is brilliant for illustrating this. In his legendary TED Talk about education, he's talking about his wife. He says, "If my wife is cooking a meal at home, which is not often now, at that exact moment, the audience expects him to make a standard, slightly grumpy husband complaint about her not cooking. He creates the expectation. Then he drops the pivot, thankfully."
It's perfect. The expectation of a complaint is instantly broken by the revelation that she is simply a terrible cook. The audience laughs, it's short, it's sharp, it doesn't require a drum roll. Or take Dan Pink talking about his background. He says he graduated in the part of his law school class that made the top 90%, he pauses, possible.
Meaning he was at the absolute bottom of the class. That is so clever. But I have to push back here on behalf of anyone listening who is terrified of public speaking. When I hear experts say, "Just use humor," my anxiety spikes. I am not Sir Ken Robinson.
Okay.
What if my attempt at a pivot completely bombs? What if I say, "Thankfully," and the room is just dead silent?
That fear is the awkward silence is why the text recommends a very specific safety net self-deprecation. Notice that both Dan Pink and Sir Ken Robinson were making fun of themselves, or, in Robinson's case, playfully teasing his own household. If you poke fun at your own flaws, your own mistakes, or playfully over-exaggerate your own lack of skill in an area, it dramatically lowers the audience's defenses. It makes you intensely likable and relatable.
That makes sense.
And here is the secret weapon of self-deprecation. If the comment fails to get a massive laugh, it doesn't create an awkward, tension-filled silence. It just comes across as endearing humility. It is a zero-risk strategy for building rapport.
Zero-risk humility. I like that framing. It takes the pressure off having to be a stand-up comedian. Right, we are moving into the final S of the success framework, the ultimate Trojan horse. We've talked about simplicity, concrete sensory details, and hacking the emotional center. But if emotion is the fuel of persuasion, storytelling is the vehicle that actually delivers the payload.
Storytelling is arguably the most powerful technology humans have ever invented. Long before written language, it was how our ancestors transmitted vital survival information, cultural norms, and history across generations. We are biologically, evolutionarily wired to process narrative above all other forms of data.
The source illustrates the raw, persuasive power of story versus statistics with the Subway sandwich franchise. This is a classic marketing case study. In the late 90s, Subway was running a highly logical, fact-based marketing campaign called 7 Under 6. The entire campaign highlighted the data point that they had 7 different sandwiches with under 6 grams of fat. It was pure, undeniable nutritional data.
And it was completely forgettable. It did not move the needle on sales because data does not inspire action.
Then, almost by accident, they discovered Jared Fogle, A college student who weighed over 400 pounds and managed to lose an incredible amount of weight by eating nothing but Subway sandwiches. The marketing team scraps the statistics. They put Jared on TV, holding up his massive old pants, and they just tell his story. Sales jump 20%. And the craziest part is, at one point, they briefly pulled his ads off the air, and sales immediately dropped. When they brought the story back, sales rose again.
As the executive speech coach Patricia Fripp notes in the source material, people are trained to resist a sales pitch, but no one can resist a good story. A story functions exactly like a Trojan horse. When an audience hears data, their critical faculties activate. They look for flaws in the argument. But when you say, let me tell you about a guy named Jared, the audience lowers their critical defenses. They lean in to enjoy the narrative, and your persuasive message that Subway is a healthy choice slips inside the fortress, perfectly undetected.
So how do we actually build the perfect Trojan horse? Because not all stories are created equal. The text outlines a specific blueprint, the 5 C's of great stories, and it uses a profoundly moving TED Talk by Leslie Morgan Steiner about her experience surviving domestic violence to illustrate these mechanics. Let's really take our time and break down the anatomy of how she structured this narrative.
It is a masterclass in narrative tension. The first C is characters. But the text emphasizes that just naming someone is not enough. They must have visual descriptions to trigger that internal credibility we discussed earlier. Steiner didn't just refer to my ex-husband as a faceless concept. She described him specifically having apple cheeks and wheat blonde hair. She painted a vivid picture of a seemingly harmless, all-American man so the audience could visualize the scene.
The second C is conflict. This is the hook of the story. Without conflict, a story is just a chronological sequence of events. I woke up, I ate breakfast, I went to work. That's not a story.
Right, there's no stakes.
Exactly. Steiner's conflict was intensely harrowing. The physical, escalating abuse she suffered, juxtaposed against her own profound emotional denial and genuine love for him. The tension between those two realities pulls the audience to the edge of their seats.
The third C is the cure, the resolution, the climax, or the sudden realization that breaks the conflict. For Steiner, the cure wasn't a neat, happy moment. It was a terrifying final beating that finally, completely shattered her psychological denial, forcing her to confront the brutal reality that he was going to kill her if she stayed.
The fourth C is change. How does the character shift, physically or spiritually, as a result of the cure? A story is only meaningful if the character at the end is fundamentally different from the character at the beginning. Steiner changed from a woman trapped in silence, shame, and denial to a fierce survivor who left the relationship, broke her silence, told the police, told her family, and eventually stood on a TED stage to tell the world.
And the final C, which is the most critical step for any presentation, is the carry-out message. What is the core takeaway for the audience? Why did you spend the last 10 minutes telling them this story? If you don't provide a carry-out, it's just self-indulgence.
So what was hers?
Steiner's carry-out message wasn't just, look at this terrible thing that happened to me. Her message was a direct call to action. We as a society must stop blaming victims for staying. We must learn to recognize the hidden early signs of domestic violence, and we must actively help victims find a safe way out. The story of her marriage was the vehicle. The carry-out message was the payload inside the Trojan horse.
Characters, conflict, cure, change, carry out. It's a perfect, repeatable blueprint for any topic. Which brings us finally to the physical execution. You've written the perfect script. It's simple, unexpected, concrete, emotional, and wrapped in a story. Now, you actually have to stand on a brightly lit stage or at the head of a silent boardroom table and deliver it.
The mechanics of physical delivery can amplify your brilliant message, or they can completely destroy it. And the text emphasizes that your delivery starts before you even speak your very first word. It advocates strongly for the pre-speech pause.
I always use the analogy of an orchestral conductor here. Imagine a symphony. The conductor walks out to the podium, steps up, and raises the baton. They do not just start wildly waving their arms the second they reach the stand. They raise the baton and they hold it in the air in absolute pin-drop silence for a full 2 or 3 seconds. That silence commands the room.
Yes, it creates anticipation.
It forces all the musicians to focus, and it forces the audience to lean in. Taking a deliberate beat before you speak gathers the audience's attention, establishes your authority, and frankly, it gives your own nervous system a moment to calm down.
It projects immense, grounded confidence. From that moment of silence you begin, and you must master eye contact. The text recommends a very specific technique called the scan and stop method. Most nervous speakers just sweep their eyes across the room continuously, like a lighthouse beam. They never actually look at anyone.
Right, they are just staring at the back wall, trying not to faint.
Exactly. The scan and stop method requires you to find one specific person in the audience, lock eyes with them, and deliver a full thought or a full sentence directly to them. Then you pause, move your gaze, lock eyes with someone else in a different part of the room, and deliver the next thought. It makes a vast room of 1,000 people feel like an intimate series of one-on-one conversations.
And posture. We have to talk about what the text calls the fig leaf pose. I see this in corporate presentations all the time. It's that defensive posture, where the speaker stands with their hands clasped tightly together right in front of their crotch, like a fig leaf on a statue.
It is a subconscious biological reaction to feeling threatened. You're protecting your vital organs, but to the audience, it signals intense fear, insecurity, and a desire to be anywhere else. You must adopt an open posture. Let your hands rest at your sides when not gesturing. And crucially, the text notes a principle of scale. A bigger audience requires a bigger you. If you are speaking to 5 people in a small room, your gestures should be tight and conversational. But if you are in a massive auditorium, you need to expand your physical footprint. Your gestures must be larger, your vocal projection stronger, and your energy significantly higher just to reach the back row.
So you deliver this masterpiece with perfect eye contact and commanding posture. Now you have to stick the landing. We talked extensively about the primacy effect at the beginning, how people remember the very first thing they hear because the memory buffer is empty. The book closes by examining the opposite end of that neurological spectrum, the recency effect.
Yes. The recency effect dictates that people vividly remember the very last thing they hear, because it is the freshest information resting in their short-term memory as they walk out the door. Which means the way you end your presentation is your final, most critical opportunity to cement your core message.
And yet, think about how 90% of presentations end in the real world. The speaker clicks to the final slide. It just says questions in huge font, and they say, so yeah, that's all the data I have. Are there any questions? It is an absolute deflation of all the energy they built up.
Ending on a Q&A is a critical structural error. When you end with a Q&A, you surrender complete control of your final impression to a random audience member. Someone might ask a highly confusing, hyper-specific question. Worse, someone might ask a hostile question that puts you on the defensive. If that is the last thing that happens, that defensive, awkward exchange is exactly what the audience will remember due to the recency effect.
So if we don't end on Q&A, what is the exact formula for a powerful close?
First, you must explicitly, verbally signal the close. Use phrases like, in conclusion, or as we wrap up our time today. This acts as an auditory alarm clock. If anyone in the back row has zoned out, those specific words physically wake them up because the brain recognizes the event is ending.
They literally sit up and get their pens ready. I do that in meetings all the time.
Exactly. Once you have their absolute attention again, you briefly summarize your main points to reinforce the memory. Next, you provide hope for a better future. If your presentation was about a massive problem in your industry, you don't end on the doom and gloom. You end by painting a vivid, concrete picture of what the world looks like once this problem is solved using your solution. And finally, you deliver one single, crystal clear call to action.
Not 20 options, one action.
Tell them exactly what you want them to do the moment they leave the room. Sign the petition on your way out. Download the beta software today. Change your password right now. One clear action.
Let's take a breath and look at the incredible journey we've just mapped out for the listener today. We started with the absolute necessity of finding a brutally simple, forced prioritization core message. We learned how to build a hook, using the unexpected to shatter psychic numbing. We learned how to anchor our abstract ideas in concrete sensory details like a Star Wars toothbrush so they earn internal credibility.
It's a lot to take in, but it works.
It really does. We explored how to clear emotional obstacles and hack the brain using curiosity and self-deprecating humor. And finally, we explored how to wrap all of that into the Trojan horse of a 5C story, delivered with physical confidence and a powerful Q&A-free closing. It is quite literally a complete masterclass in human persuasion.
It is a remarkable framework.
But looking at all of this analytically, I want to leave the listener with a final, somewhat provocative thought to ponder. We have just spent this entire deep dive dissecting the psychological source code of human persuasion. We know exactly which levers to pull, the chiasmus, the pattern break, the sensory detail to bypass critical thinking and reliably generate trust and emotion. It's a highly effective blueprint, almost like an algorithm.
Precisely. So the question we must ask ourselves as we look to the future is, what happens when artificial intelligence and hyper-realistic deepfakes fully master this exact successes framework? We are rapidly entering an era where AI can be trained on these precise psychological principles. When a synthesized, photorealistic avatar can mathematically calculate the exact optimal millisecond to deploy a pre-speech pause.
Oh, wow.
When it can synthesize the precise tonal pitch of a self-deprecating chuckle to lower your defenses. And when it can instantly generate the perfect mathematically optimized Star Wars toothbrush detail to hack your internal credibility. How will we distinguish authentic human passion from mathematically optimized charisma?
Wow. If the empathy and the imperfections are perfectly engineered, does it matter if there is no ghost in the machine? That is a profound thought for you to mull over as you build your next presentation. Will you be using the Success framework to share a genuine, lived human truth? Or are you just running the code? Think about that the next time you are sitting in a boardroom, staring at a 60-slide corporate deck, wishing the speaker had just brought a real human brain on stage. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. We will see you next time.